So good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar. This evening, I am joined by Harriet Trueman, Sussex Wildlife Trust's Wilder Ouse Officer. So Harriet is normally out and about supporting work across the Ouse catchment as part of the local nature recovery network. But her other passion is dung beetles, the unsung heroes of our soils, which is the topic of tonight's talk. So before I hand over to her, just a couple of housekeeping points. This session is being recorded and a link to the recording will be emailed to everyone once it is available. Your cameras and microphones will be switched off, so if you would like to ask a question, this can be typed in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will give time at the end of the talk to answer as many questions as we can. So these webinars are free to everyone, but if you would be interested in further supporting the work of the Trust, at the end you will be automatically redirected to our donations page, and any donation would be much appreciated. So that's it from me, and I will now hand you over to Harriet.
Thank you, Jane. Can you just let me know if you can hear me all right, Jane?
I'll let you know if any messages come in, but I can hear you.
Perfect. All right, brilliant. Thank you so much, Jane. Yeah, so as Jane mentioned, I am Harriet Trueman. So I am the Wild Ouse Officer at Sussex Wildlife Trust, and I do have a passion for dung beetles. So thank you very much for joining. We are going to crack on. I'm very sorry. My dog has just decided to start chewing a squeaky toy upstairs and I can hear it. So apologies if that's coming through. But yeah, introductions first. So who am I and why do I love dung beetles? So as I've said, I work at Sussex Wildlife Trust and I grew I'm really sorry about the squeaky toy, everybody. That was not planned. So I started my passion for dung beetles when I did my master's at Sussex University, which was in 2022, so about 4 years ago now. And they sort of put out lots of projects, and dung beetles was one of the projects. And I sort of was quite interested. I'm very self-taught in my conservation knowledge. And one of the things I didn't know a lot about was dung beetles. And I think that goes for a lot of people. They seem to be a bit of an underdog and under-researched. So I really started to explore what that meant and decided to go with the project. And that really grew this massive passion because it really highlighted to me how under-researched they are and that they're an underdog, yet they have such an economical and ecological value. So it's kind of where it grew. And then from there, it just went a lot wider. And then after my master's, I started a job at Surrey Wildlife Trust, where I worked in the engagement team in the education sort of side of things. And I got to sort of talk about dung beetles sometimes to young people or to community groups. And I really found that I loved telling people about dung beetles and why they're so important, which is what I'm going to do in this webinar today. So hopefully you'll leave with either a little bit more knowledge or a little bit more love for dung beetles. So first things first, I'm just going to skim over what my role is currently at the Trust. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about how at Sussex Wildlife Trust we champion dung beetles. So how I use that in my role and how the wider sort of team champion dung beetles sort of pan Sussex. So Wilder Ouse. Wilder Ouse is a landscape scale project at the Trust. And it operates in the River Ouse catchment, which is this map on the right. So the blue is the river, so you can see the river is really vast, all the way from the headwaters up here in Ashdown Forest, all the way down to where the river meets the sea at Newhaven. So within this catchment, I work with landowners, land managers, parish councils, district councils, communities, and the main aim of the work is to sort of restore ecological connectivity through being bigger, better, more joined up, which is sort of the image on the left-hand side, which is the Lawton Principles. So we do this with those sort of really key groups. We deliver on-the-ground nature recovery. So we've got a team of really passionate volunteers at Wilder Ouse. We're really lucky who, over the past 8 months, have also really shared their knowledge with me. So they're really valuable. And we deliver that sort of on-the-ground nature recovery, whether that's tree planting, wetland restoration, hand digging ponds, leaky dams, you name it. They do so much. And we also collaborate with a lot of other projects going on in the catchment. So that might be the Will to Waves project or sort of the South Downs National Park project as well. So that's just a really quick whistle-stop tour of Wilder Ouse. And now we're going to sort of get into the dung beetles. Now, I will warn you, this webinar does feature quite a lot of pictures of poo. So I hope everyone's either already had their dinner. There are quite a lot of pictures of poo. Obviously, dung beetles live in poo. So just brace yourselves for that. And I hope no one's too squeamish about poo. So our UK dung beetles, we have actually got a total of 60 species in the UK, which is actually quite a lot. And I remember when I sort of started looking into dung beetles as species, that also surprised me. So it might surprise some of you. In the world, I think we've got about 9,500 that are sort of being recorded, well, as are on record at the moment. That does go up sort of every decade, that new species might be getting identified and named. And they've kind of got a really long history and a lot of attachment to sort of myths and legends dating back to sort of ancient Egypt times. They were sort of seen as like a symbol of rebirth. And there was actually a goddess of the sun. I can't remember her name, but I think they sort of believed that she rolled the sun across the sky, kind of like a dung beetle would roll dung, which is really cool. So all of the species in the UK are sort of rely on dung for survival for parts of their life cycle. And it kind of makes you think, well, what happens if dung isn't available? And then dung beetles have been known to sort of been opportunistic, where they might opt for sort of decaying fungi or rotting carrion as sort of part of their diet as well. And we can break those 60 species down into taxonomic groups. So we have our aphodines, which is our biggest sort of taxonomic group with 44 species. And you can sort of see this shape up here basically gives you an outline of the shape of the body of sort of an aphodine dung beetle, which makes it a lot easier to sort of group an ID. We have Onophagus, and that has got 8 species in it, and that belongs to the family Scarabidae. And we have got the Geotrupidae species, which is the most well-known one, I would say. They are door beetles. So you might have seen those before. They tend to be a lot larger, and they are in the family Geotrupidae. So how do they eat? What do they eat? They obviously, as I've mentioned, eat poo. How do they eat this poo? They actually sort of slurp up a lot of the liquid within poo, the sort of the nutrient-rich liquid, and dry it out. That's when they're at sort of adult stage. And they're kind of sort of separated out into different functionalities. So by that, I mean the way that they sort of breed and the way that they eat. So the aphodines group are either dwellers or stealers. So dwellers sort of dwell within the dung pat. Our Onophagus species are tunnelers, which means they dig down into the ground. And our Geotrupidae are also tunnelers. We're going to look at this a little bit more. So our tunneler species, you can see from this image here, actually dig down into the soil, bringing along sort of a brood ball, which is kind of like a ball of dung. And they put it into a brood chamber, and they will lay an egg on that brood ball. And that is where it sort of hatches and turns into larvae, and it eats that dung around it. Now, that image actually says that they can dig down to 1 metre. They've actually been known to go further than that. This is just sort of UK dung beetles, by the way. I know there's reports of sort of going 1.5 metres down into the ground. So it really demonstrates the depths that they can go to. And our dwellers, like I mentioned, they live their whole life cycle within the dung pat, sort of laying their eggs either in the pat itself or sort of laying it where the dung pat and the soil interact, the interface between the soil and the dung. So yeah, that dung pat is their whole habitat. And there's also stealers. So stealers often sort of take advantage of the tunnelers, and they might occupy the tunnels for their own development of their young, and steal some of that dung in that chamber as well. So what's missing? So this is what's really different about dung beetle species in the UK that you might have seen on the telly. We don't have any roller species. So to say, I will come to some images later that I have seen, which are almost like dung beetles actually rolling dung. So personally, I think that there are sort of characteristics of rollers. But yeah, our main ecological functions in the UK is we have our tunnellers and our dwellers, and those ecological functions through the way that they eat and the way that they breed are really important for us as humans as well, and we're going to touch upon that later. So it's very easy, well, not easy, but straightforward after a little bit of practice to group dung beetles into their taxonomic group, mainly because of those shapes that I sort of mentioned earlier, where you can sort of see they're sort of maybe like an elongated oval or a bit more like an egg shape. But actually getting them down to species level is quite intricate and quite difficult. And I had to do this in my master's, and it is really challenging. And you do need a microscope really to make an accurate identification of that species. There was a project called the Dung Beetle Mapping Project, which unfortunately, I think it was Oxford University or Oxford Natural History Museum that was running that project. And it unfortunately has come to an end, but a lot of their resources are still available. And they sort of have keyed out a lot of those species, especially in the aphodines group, because that's the biggest one. So that's probably the hardest one to identify. And all of these sort of this anatomy of a dung beetle here sort of relays into how you get that to species level. So it could be to do with the length of sort of this bit here, the scutellum. The length of that will help you sort of identify the species, so it's easier to get it under a microscope. One thing that is quite crucial here is different species will occupy dung from different animals and at different times of year. So some species might just come out between October to February, so just for those sort of colder winter months, and some species might come out around sort of April to September. So that can give you a little bit of an indication about what species it is if you have this key with you that sort of gives you a breakdown of the times of year that they're out. It's a really good key, actually. So I've just got a couple of videos here that I'm just going to show you and hope that they work, just to show you the 3 different taxonomic groups and how they move and what they look like. I also think they're very cute, so hopefully you'll get that impression through the videos. I hope this is coming through all right. It's probably lagging a little bit in our tests, it did. So this is T. fossa. So this is the aphodines group. You can actually see this species got sort of in the video, it's got 3 small little bumps on its head. That helps you with that species idea. This is my favourite species. This is Onophagus similis, and this one is very cute. And I think what's interesting about this video is you can really see those front arms and sort of the width of them. And this is a tunneler species, so they have so much strength in their little bodies that if you hold them and they sort of go in between your fingers, it's almost painful how much they can push, and those arms demonstrate that. This is, I mean, one of our well-known species. This is a minotaur beetle. So this is the Duotrupidae family. It's a very beautiful beetle. That's a male with those sort of 3 horns that you can see. This is a page all about poo. So as I mentioned, different species of dung beetle will reside in different types of poo. So we have species that are generalist and species that are specialist. So our generalists are not fussy. They might not necessarily always have a preference for what they go in, and our specialists might have a preference for what dung they like, where they like the dung, if it's in a shaded habitat or if it's open grassland. And they exist in all sorts of dung, really. So your cattle, sheep, deer, rabbit, alpaca, but sort of the aphodines group tend to prefer cattle, most of them anyway, I believe. This could be slightly wrong. As I have mentioned, these are quite an under-researched species, so sometimes the evidence isn't always there to sort of be able to make a good assumption. But one of the things that's really important with poo consistency is we want it of a good consistency, because it provides dung beetles with a really good home to live in, which sort of requires dung beetles to have good fibre in their diet. Not dung beetles, sorry, cows to have good fibre in their diet, and that sort of leads to a really good structured dung pat. And if it's really watery, dung beetles can actually drown in it, and it's not really like hospitable pat, I suppose. It also a good structured deep pat of cow dung means that they actually can hide from predators. So they might get predated by things like storks, or jackdaws will actually turn over the dung pat. I'm just going to quickly show you these videos. So as I mentioned, sort of the rolling behaviour, this is a species, I'm going to try and pronounce the Latin, typhoeus, which this is a rabbit sort of sheep specialist sort of dunger. That this video on the right, you can almost see it sort of rolling the dung, and it was the first time I'd actually witnessed this behaviour happening. So it's just that they're not making that ball themselves. Obviously rabbit poo is already a circle, but you can see in this video here that the dung beetle, it's skipped, actually is starting to dig into the ground, and that is a tunneler species, so will dig and create its brood chamber and bring that ball of dung down. This is also the Fodine species that is just walking across the dung, but I just wanted to show quickly because it shows the variation of sort of habitats. Like the typhoeus was out in sort of grassland with its dung, whereas this is a dweller in its dung pat, digging down, nice and cozy. Yeah. So dung beetle life cycles, it's quite similar to a lot of other sort of invertebrates and insects. So it begins at sort of an egg stage, and they're usually laid sort of individually or in a batch, either in the dung pat or in the brood chamber. And a female can lay sort of 10 to 1,000 eggs, not at a time, but over the sort of year. But the lower end of those numbers tend to be more common. And then they sort of hatch into this sort of C-shaped larvae, and they look very different to what the adult beetles look like. They actually have really strong mouth parts, which means they're able to get through the fibrous material within the dung pat as well. And then as larvae, they'll just develop and grow, and they'll molt, increasing in size. And then they'll sort of turn into a pupae for a couple of well, I think it's anywhere between a couple of weeks and a month, and it depends on environmental conditions as to when they'll emerge as an adult. That's one of a brilliant adaptation of dung beetles, is they can emerge when they feel like the time is right. We don't really know much about the actual life cycle in terms of how long they live in adulthood. It could sort of be all the way from egg to adulthood, anywhere between sort of 6 months to a year. So again, another really big under-researched part of dung beetles. But yeah, so those ecological functions that I mentioned earlier, which is how they sort of breed and eat, so they tunnel, they dwell, actually relates to different ecosystem services. So an ecosystem service is essentially a direct or an indirect way that it benefits humans, essentially. And you can kind of categorize those into the 4 categories you can see on the screen at the minute. So we're going to explore a little bit of how dung beetles might, their ecological functions and the way they eat and the way they breed, and how that gives us different ecosystem services, and that gives them real importance within our ecosystems. So you've sort of got supporting ecosystem services, so sort of nutrient cycling, water cycling. You've got provisioning, which is sort of providing food, fresh water, biomass fuel, natural medicine. You've got regulating, so regulating the air quality, water runoff, things like that. And then you've got the cultural side as well, which is sort of the recreational side, ecotourism, things like that. So let's explore how dung beetles give us some ecosystem services. So one of the biggest things that they do for our agricultural systems is dung decomposition. So they break down dung pats, which is a job not many other people want to do. And it's, to be fair, also just to say, it's not just dung beetles that are sort of living their lives within this dung pat. There are other sort of organisms and species that do utilise dung pats as food. But just for today, we'll just obviously are talking about dung beetles. So that dung decomposition that they do, breaking that down, if we didn't have them doing that, we would actually see a really large accumulation of dung within our pasture. And lots of researchers sort of suggested that we would estimatingly lose about 5% of our grazing pasture availability annually. So that would be because a dung pat would sort of be sitting on the grass, And if there's nothing that's sort of decomposing it, it would be reliant on weathering to remove it. And that's a really long process, which often means that the grass totally dies and you lose that pasture land. So that's a really important thing that they do. Parasite suppression. So thinking about sort of our livestock, and they might have things like flies that break out that can damage them, or worms. And by worms, I don't mean sort of earthworms. I mean things like nematodes, which are parasitic worms. This is definitely an area, just to say, that does need more research in it, because the relationship between dung beetles and parasites is quite complex. There's a lot of things at play within a dung pat, whether it's raining really heavily and things like that. But there is still some really strong research to suggest that they are brilliant biological methods of control for parasites. And by that, I mean they control the parasites themselves. They are the method that we can control our parasites within our livestock. So thinking back to how they actually sort of eat dung, they suck out those juices, as I mentioned, disgusting. They slurp up that poo, and that actually dries the dung out, which can reduce sort of the hatch rate of certain species of worms and flies. Because the dung is drier, they actually don't hatch. They also, so in this picture down here, you can see this is an upside down dung beetle, and it's got tiny little mites on it, and they actually transport those mites from dung pat to dung pat, and those mites eat fly eggs. So again, that's a way that they're sort of being those biological methods of control and reducing fly egg numbers. And there is a really interesting case study in Australia where in the 1950s, they basically were seeing a real load of dung accumulation. So they were losing pasture land. There wasn't enough dung beetles to be breaking down the dung. And Australia has, well, presently it's got a really huge number of cattle. So there was a scientist and entomologist who introduced 5 different species of dung beetle from places like Hawaii and Africa. And 3 of those species became established within Australia and actually started to really break down that dung. And what they also saw is it massively reduced bush fly outbreaks as well. And just as a general, the ecosystem was a lot healthier, which also gives weight to dung beetles being an indicator species for a healthy ecosystem. So if dung beetles are present, it usually means you're doing the right thing, which is great. Secondary seed dispersal, so where they sort of move dung around. If you've got a vertebrate that's sort of eating fruit or eating something with seeds, they're going to be sort of moving that dung around within the soil and actually dispersing the seeds, which is funny. They also clean the dung, so they want the dung. If they're making a brood ball, they don't want this sort of seed in their dung ball, so they will actually remove the seed where it might come into contact with sort of the soil surface, and therefore you've sort of changed the original location of the seed. Soil health. So this picture is a really good illustration of when dung beetles are present and when they're not present. Now, I'm sure that you'll be able to sort of take from what I've already talked about where dung beetles are and where they're not. So well done if you said the one on the right. Just to go back so you can see it, you can see that there's a wealth of activity underneath that dung pat. And one thing that really gives weight to the sort of loss of pasture land is you can see that the grass is growing back because the dung has sort of decomposed. So not only this, is they also add sort of nitrates and phosphates into the soil. They sort of dig down, they aerate the soil, they reduce compaction through their tunneling behaviour. So it gives them, like, there's a lot of weight behind all these different actions they do. They improve soil health a lot. So this is just that image again where you can sort of see everything going on underneath a dung pat, which I think is fascinating. So they're also a food source for lots of other species of wildlife. So some dung beetles are nocturnal, some sort of are day flying, some are nocturnal. So they'll come out at night time, and lots of species of bat will actually enjoy eating dung beetles, and bats need approximately 3,000 insects to eat a night. So they're also part of that greater ecosystem and that food chain. They are also a food source for badgers, and as I mentioned, certain species of birds will actually trawl through the dung to find dung beetles. I've actually seen them doing that. So this is where it gets really interesting. So there is a study and loads of research that suggests that dung beetles actually have a ginormous economic value for our agricultural systems. And that has been estimated at £367 million in the UK annually. And actually, if we were to protect dung beetles more under certain agri-environmental schemes, we could put another 40 million on top of that. So it really shows how important that they are. These are just estimates, and they could be either overestimating or they could also be underestimating. It's quite hard to put a figure on what they're doing, but it is really important that we sort of understand how economically important they are. A little bit about how dung beetles move around. So when I was doing my research, I looked a little bit into dispersal, because unfortunately we sort of know very little about how dung beetles travel, disperse in temperate climates, so in climates like the UK, and we don't really know how that impacts their ability to sort of recolonize areas. So if you had grazing there for 20 years, if you then removed that grazing away for 5 years, the dung beetles, how long, if you then reintroduce grazing again, how long will it take for dung beetles to recolonize? How far can they fly? And does this make them more at risk to local extinction? There's just a little video here of when I was doing my research. So I was doing sort of live recaptures. So I would mark them with non-toxic paint at a central release point. They'd all fly out, and I'd try and recapture them. Unfortunately, I didn't recapture any, because it's very hard to do dispersal studies on invertebrates. I tried twice as well. So it didn't give us any clearer answer as to sort of how they travel. But it gives weight to thinking about that bigger, better, more and joined up. We need more to make sure that if there's sort of local livestock, is there enough sort of other livestock locally that they can sort of flip between to improve their genetic diversity as well. Now, this week is a little bit sad. We're going to talk a little bit about dung beetles and how they're threatened. And unfortunately, they are in quite a catastrophic decline. We're going to look at the reasons in a minute. So there was a study in 2016 by Natural England that looked at sort of the review of status of beetles. And this kind of came out with this pie chart you can see. So you can see that 50% or just over are actually recognised as nationally scarce or threatened to some sort of degree. And also sort of over the past 50 years, 4 species have potentially gone locally extinct as well, which is devastating. And it will have huge impacts on our agricultural systems. We won't see dung being gotten rid of. We'll see lots of dung accumulating, which isn't necessarily what we want at all. And there is a massive irony here that the intensive side of agriculture is compromising the functions on which it relies. So it relies on dung beetles, but unfortunately the intensification of agriculture is damaging dung beetles. So let's explore that a little bit. Why are they decreasing? What are we doing? And how can we maybe do some different things? So agricultural intensification. So a big one here is the use of different worming medications. So sort of chemical parasitic control products like ivermectins. So it doesn't even matter how these are sort of given to the cattle, whether they're injected or depositories or anything like that. It is estimated that up to 90% of these chemicals will pass straight into the dung. So as you can imagine, any creatures that live within that dung, that eat that dung, then become a non-target species for those chemicals. And unfortunately, that can massively impact our dung beetles at larval stage, at adulthood, and yeah, really impacts them in their ability to sort of reproduce. And it's really sad, actually, and the 90% is such a huge amount that travels into the dung. And also what we're seeing is sort of parasites becoming resistant to these medications anyway. So it gives weight to using dung beetles as good biological methods of control. Reduction in dung availability. So as I mentioned earlier, dung beetles can come out at different temporal times. So they might come out during winter, they might come out during summer, they might come out the whole year round. So what they need all year round is dung and different types of dung. And what we unfortunately see is we see a lot of things like overwintering, so bringing cows inside into the barn to sort of overwinter in there, which actually means that there's no poo to eat. So the dung beetles haven't actually, if they're winter species, they haven't necessarily got access to the food that they need or for the food for their larvae either. And that's similar with things like if you have horses and you do poo picking, you're sort of removing that habitat from the land. So the habitat loss and connectivity, as we don't know a lot about how dung beetles move around, we don't necessarily understand the barriers that they have, but it's probably the assumption that if they haven't got other local wild places that they can get to that have got livestock and sort of herbivores, that's going to impair their ability to recolonize and to sort of have genetic diversity. And so certain species are also shade preferring. So if you've just got a really open field that's all in direct sunlight, not all species are going to have a preference for that. So we're needing a mosaic of habitats for dung beetles to really excel. Obviously the loss of pasture land and going to other uses, like maybe for housing or for development. So I suppose inside of this as well, it's things like climate change and thinking about how dung beetles will be impacted by global warming. I know there is some research out there. It's not necessarily species within the UK, but there will be impacts there. If we're seeing those hotter summers and those drier summers, we need shaded areas to sort of protect these species as well. Dung consistency. So I've got some lovely images here for you where you can compare two different types of dung pats. So the one on the left hand side is quite a watery splatter. There's not much protection there. There's not many places to sort of hide from predators, unfortunately. So it's not necessarily a good pat to have. The one on the right hand side is a really good structured dung that dung beetles can get into, they can hide into. And this is sort of reflects like a change in livestock diet. So actually a varied diet with lots of choice of vegetation to eat is going to probably increase the fibre within their poo, which makes dung pats more habitable for dung beetles. And I think thinking about that variety of dung that we need different types of herbivores to support dung beetles and a variety of those. So how do we champion dung beetles at Sussex Wildlife Trust? So we operate pan Sussex across the whole of East and West Sussex, and I just want to say that it's not actually only these teams that necessarily champion dung beetles. I've kind of just picked out a few that I can talk about and sort of inform you what we do at Sussex Wildlife Trust to ensure we can create the best spaces for dung beetles to excel and to support a variety of species within our landscape. So the Wild Landscapes team, that is where I reside. So we have two sister projects within the Wilder Landscapes team. So we have got Wilder Ouse and we have got Wilder Horsham District. And one of the big parts of our job is to land advise. So we might go out to farmers, landowners, land managers, communities and parishes to offer up advice in different sort of practices. So for instance, if we were sort of going to a farm, we might discuss sort of sustainable farming practices, and we sort of think about, we talk often about sort of avoiding using blanket use of veterinary wormers. So that is when you just have a time of year where you blanket worm, or multiple times a year where you blanket worm all of the livestock that you have. And obviously, as we've talked about, that has detrimental effects for dung beetles. So we're able to really relay that information, which will not only benefit dung beetles. I think that's what's important. It's not just dung beetles that will be protected here. That stops all those chemicals from sort of leaking into our landscapes. But also, we are very aware that sometimes we do need to worm at times, and chemical practices do still need to be used. So it's mainly about having a collaborative conversation about how we can work together rather than offering two very harsh different sides. It's all about compromise. We'll talk about varied diet choices, so maybe being able to offer the herbivores or the livestock a variation of things they can eat to improve dung consistency. So being able to eat maybe scrubbier stuff or sort of different sort of shrubs and trees. It also allows then the species to have a choice, and they often know their own, they can self-medicate a lot through sort of medicinal plants and things like that. We often sort of talk about mosaic of habitats, so having shaded areas which will offer sort of habitats for certain species of dung beetles, and we also deliver that. So both projects go out and actively deliver on the ground nature recovery, so through creating small woodland copses or hedge planting and things like that. So we advise that, but we also go out and deliver that. So avoiding dung removal, so things like poo picking, as I mentioned, and then sort of advising and avoiding overwintering in barns, or avoid again coming to a compromise of not overwintering the whole winter and doing it in turns and things like that. We have our Sussex Wildlife Trust grazing team. So we operate with no fence collars for a lot of our cattle, and no fence collars means that they're not necessarily fenced in. It means the collars control where they can roam. I mean, I'm not in this team, and Tom Parry, who's one of the grazers, has sort of chatted to me before about the dung beetle stuff they do. So this is all information from that. And they graze as many of our reserves as possible and throughout the year as well, to make sure that all those dung beetles that are maybe only out and about in wintertime have also got access to dung. And they also do fecal egg counts. So fecal egg counts are sort of when you go out and you take samples of a certain amount of your livestock out of a flock, and you test them for worm eggs. So you look to see if they actually need worming. Rather than just doing it as blanket worming, they do more as and when. And they'll also then quarantine those animals that are wormed. So rather than sort of letting them out straight away onto all of the pasture, they might quarantine an area. So then it's just a smaller area of the reserve that is impacted, or keep them in, or something like that. Our communications teams do lots of brilliant communications about dung beetles, and sort of put the word out about what the species do, why they're so important, and their roles within our ecosystems, which is brilliant. We also obviously have this, which is put on by Jane, which is our adult learning team as well. So it's all about sort of sharing the knowledge that is out there about dung beetles, no longer making them an underdog, and giving them a space in conservation to really be sort of shouted about, really. We have communities and education. So I know that actually our education team have been doing sort of the John Muir project, and I know they actually did a whole feature on dung beetles out on Chailey Common, where they looked for dung beetles and sort of saw the behaviours that they were showing, which I think is also really, really important. So a little bit about, if you are feeling like you really like dung beetles now, how can you help? I think one of the biggest things is advocacy for dung beetles. It's kind of giving them a space to be heard about. It's sort of communicating about dung beetles to either farms or landowners, or just having a chat with people and asking if they knew that we have dung beetles in the country, because often people don't, or asking if they have ever looked in a dung pat on a nice, lovely walk on a summer's day. Social media and forms of communication, sharing stuff online, being an advocate for them. And there's also lots of potential for citizen science exploration and projects, because you can get them down to their taxonomic group really easily. So sort of if they're a dweller, or if they're a tunneler, or if those three groups through the shape of their bodies, it means that you can get a citizen science project without getting them down to species level. And I think that that's a really great way to assess the health of ecosystems, the health of dung beetles, and sort of looking at how they're coping within our landscape, because I still think it's a big part that's being missed. So if there's anybody out there that's got maybe a keen eye for starting up a citizen science project on dung beetles, wow, that would be brilliant. I think that is about everything. It's quite a whistle-stop tour of dung beetles. There's loads more out there, and there's also loads more out there about dung beetles that aren't necessarily in the UK. So in the tropics, there's tends to be a lot more research, and there's a little bit more known about how they sort of travel and their dispersal. But the UK is definitely, or temperate climates are definitely a bit of an anomaly. So it's sort of really trying to piece together what we know and what else could we start to explore, which was a big part of what my research was. You kind of highlight, actually, well, we can't make these assumptions because the research doesn't back it up. But yeah, that's basically everything. Thank you very much. I don't know if we're going to questions now, Jane, if anyone's got any.
Yes, there's quite a few that have come in. Thanks so much, Harriet. And
Oh dear.
I think some of them are quite similar and not too challenging, so don't worry. But yes, I love the idea of setting up a citizen science project. I think that would be fantastic. So first question is from Peter saying, do dung beetles only live in or on the dung of vegetarian animals?
So no, they won't. They also will go for carnivore dung. So I know that they will sometimes go on things like dog poo. Actually, one of their big preferences in the world of research is actually human poo. So people will use human poo as sort of doing pitfall traps. So that's where you maybe put poo out and you wait for dung beetles to come along. So no, they don't only live in herbivore dung. A lot of our carnivore dung we sort of have here from dogs and things has obviously got, again, high levels of sort of chemicals in it. And also you maybe don't see dog poos where they are so in areas where maybe there is already a colony of dung beetles locally, unless you're sort of taking them to grazed places. But yeah, no, they're not only subject to herbivore dung.
Okay, thank you. The next question from Alice is, how long do the parasite chemicals stay in the animal's dung?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't actually know the answer to that one, but I imagine it's probably the whole time. If you mean as in how often, so if the cattle has been treated, we would usually probably recommend they're being quarantined, I think, about 3 weeks at least. So that's how long that those chemicals maybe stay within the cattle. Within the dung pat, they'd be there the whole time, I would imagine. They wouldn't actually break down. So if you've got a dung pat and it's been there for 48 hours, I don't imagine those chemicals have broken down within that 48 hours at all. And it would probably stay within the cattle for 3 weeks, if not maybe more. Probably depends on the medication, depends on the size of the animal, and things like that.
Okay, thank you. Similar question to the first one. It says, love your enthusiasm for dung beetles. They deserve it! Exclamation mark. Do dung beetles eat dung from wild animals as well as livestock? Do they only live on farmland? So I think you'd answered the first bit, but it'd be interesting
Yeah,
to know.
it's sort of similar. They will go for carnivore dung as well. There's probably, I'll be very honest. And I think because of when you're doing experiments, you tend to use herbivore dung because it's a lot less dangerous. In terms of the carnivore dung tends to be a lot more hazardous. So if you're ever doing research or something like that, you tend to use herbivore dung because in the UK anyway, it's a lot more sort of ethically okay to use and a lot less risk for the person doing the experiment. But yeah, they will break down sort of foxes' poo and things that are carnivorous or omnivores as well.
Okay, so they like everything. Um, is there any research into how long it takes for dung beetles to appear in a habitat where poo removal has decreased, for example, or livestock grazing has started?
So dung has decreased. So this is probably linking to recolonization. So that's sort of like, this is a really under-researched area to my knowledge. There might be more research out there, but often sort of research journals also have sort of fees attached to them. So I can't necessarily always access all the newest research on dung beetles, which is really sad. But if you, I suppose, are sort of introducing livestock to an area, how long will it take for dung beetles to come? That probably depends on factors such as the connectivity of where you're introducing livestock to. Is there a local farm nearby? Is that within a certain amount of distance that they're going to be able to recolonize? And because we don't know much about how far they can fly in temperate climates, it's really under researched. I mean, if I was to take a guess, an educated guess, they can travel far. They're okay, but they're slightly clumsy flyers. I didn't actually talk about how they navigate either. So if there's a question for that, we can chat about that as well. But again, there's limited research on that in temperate climates. I think there's some research in the tropics that kind of has certain species able to travel like 200 meters, and they're probably going further than that. That's just all the research is kind of thrown out for now. And the other thing to sort of mention is it's also impact the distance they can travel is also dependent on the size of the beetle. The Geotrupidae species tend to be much better flyers than sort of the smaller ones. The smaller ones tend to be quite clumsy, and maybe don't always. If you ever go and sit by a dung pat when it's fresh, just wait. The dung beetles will come if you're in a sort of livestocked area, and you'll see that they sort of land maybe like a metre away or like 50 centimetres away. So they're quite clumsy. But again, it is just a really under-researched area. So it's quite difficult to know how long it would take them to appear once you start grazing.
Okay, so the next question was the same actually, and they're actually talking about a specific. So they've got Sussex cattle have been introduced to a new rewilding project at Wild Tolworth and are due to be there year round. How long might it take for dung beetles to appear naturally? And there hasn't been cattle on the land before, so I presume the answer is the same. It's a wait and see.
It is a wait and see. What I would recommend is there's a really good online, if you go on Dung Beetles for Farmers, there's some really good methodology to how you can actually start looking in the dung yourself. So I've never actually done this method. I usually get a white tray and sort of put some dung in it and have a little look round. But what's really important is you do it as ethically as possible. That dung is their habitat. So try and sort of, once you've had a look, try and almost rebuild the dung pat for them. I know that seems really weird, but that is their habitat. That's where they live. You don't want to just rip open the dung pat, spread all the dung out, and then not put it back. Some people dunk it in water. I've never tried this method. And then what happens is all the creatures within the dung float to the top. Yeah, like I say, I've not done that. But I would say if you're within the first year and you've just introduced livestock, I would say start having a look. You'll be able to tell anyway. Usually dung beetles will have little holes. It might not just be dung beetles that are leaving holes. You'll get rove beetles and water beetles and things. But you'll see holes within the top of the dung pat. That's a bit of a sign that at least things are using the pat. I would have a little look in there, look at either the Dung Beetle Mapping Project keys, or look at Dung Beetles for Farmers. They've got brilliant resources on there to help you work out what species you're getting and things like that. I don't know if we can share anything after this, Jane, in terms of the slides or links, but I'll happily
I was
put
going to
something
say if we
together.
can provide the links to that, because there'll be an email going out and we can provide the links.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I've made a note. Lovely. So Sarah's asking, I have been poo picking my pony paddock daily, but should I just leave some poo? And if so, how long for? Is there
Some
a
poo is
best
better
practice?
than no poo. I would definitely say to leave some at least. You can kind of monitor it to see if they're actually starting to start to colonize it, to see what's happening. I mean, obviously, if there's no dung beetles present, similar to what happened in Australia, you'll end up losing some of your pasture where the horses graze. So maybe do a bit of an experiment. It's always fun to experiment and get an understanding for what species are around. I would say, yeah, leave some of the poo, pick some of the poo, and then sort of see what happens, see if it starts to get broken down. Yeah.
Excellent. Next question. Do dung beetles interact with dung flies? Is there something you know?
I feel like I need to be, as in interact in terms of with their eggs, or
I suppose, is there any kind of relationship between them? Are they?
There is, I remember a piece of research that I read once that actually dung beetles, it sounds weird that sometimes they actually ingest some fly eggs when they're sort of slurping up that dung. This is for specific, it was a specific species of fly, and I don't remember what it was. But actually, when it passes through, so if you imagine a dung pat, a fly comes along, lays its egg, a dung beetle will then sort of passes, eats it, that actually kills off the fly eggs. I think it was something like a 58% rate of like decreasing the survival rate of the fly eggs. I don't know if that's what the question meant, if that answers it in any way. Or if that's what was meant by an interaction, if it means sort of relationship that's like symbiotic, as in they benefit each other, I actually don't know. That's an interesting question, though.
Another area to study. So the next question is, dung beetles look similar to stag beetles. Are there similarities?
Yes, I think so. They're within the same superfamily, I believe. They're in the same, like, so aphodines and Onophagus are in the same family as chafers as well, and scarab beetles. So they're kind of grouped together, which usually means that there are similarities in taxonomic group. In terms of actual stag beetles, I mean, stag beetle larvae tend to prefer sort of decaying wood. And they're at larval stage for a really long time. I feel like it's like 5 years. Stag beetles can live within decaying wood as larvae, and they actually prefer sort of standing dead wood as well, rather than horizontal dead wood. So they'd actually opt for standing dead wood. Interestingly though, the Minotaur beetle with its horns, so I'm sure I'm still sharing my screen, so let's go back to remind people what the Minotaur beetle looks like. So the Minotaur beetle here with its horns, so you can see this is a male species, and this has got 3 really prominent horns on its back. That is used similarly to how stag beetles may use their sort of, the greater and the lesser stags will use there to defend territory and to gain females as well, to gain mates. So there is a similarity there. I've never put that together before, but that's a really interesting point. I love it when everyone's learning.
Right, and there's quite a few similar questions coming in about, so the farmers and the landowners that you work with, are you generally finding that they're quite sympathetic to dung beetles when you sort of suggest changes? Is that something they're interested in doing?
Yes. So yeah, I tend to find, I can't speak for Wilder Horsham district, but I do tend to find that landowners are quite interested in dung beetles, whether that's because, I mean, people often refer as dung beetles as farmers' best friends, because they are doing the job of that dung decomposition. So actually sort of being able to share sort of the research that I've seen that really speaks against sort of blanket worming cattle, and sort of opting for as and when has been really adopted by a lot of our landowners, and sort of just listen to the quarantining as well. So when we sort of talk about maybe keeping those sort of wormed individuals separate from the rest of them, that has also been really adopted. Yeah, I tend to get quite a good reception from it. I mean, I've also gone onto landowners and looked in the dung that they've got, which I think tends to really sort of spark interest with landowners, because it's sort of an unknown. Again, it's not sort of normal to go up to a dung pat and look in it. It feels quite strange because it's poo. But actually you can wear gloves, you can wash your hands, like you can make sure you do it safely. But yeah, we tend to get a really good reception, actually. I do anyway.
Excellent.
Maybe it's because I'm just biased.
Well, that's good news. So the next one is, thanks, this was great. It says, do I need dung beetles on my allotment to break down manure? Are they found on allotments? Are they helpful for that sort of process?
I mean, you probably do get them in allotments if you have dung. It depends how fresh the dung is. So one of the ways that they use their antennae to sort of, you can see in this picture here, they've got some beautiful antennae on top of their heads, and they do use that to sort of sense out the dung. And I feel like if you're moving fresh dung from one place to another where it's quite quickly after it's been laid, then you probably would get dung beetles again if they're in the area. If there's already a local population of them, it could be that they come over and sort of investigate your allotment with your manure in it. But they do tend to prefer dung that's maybe come out within 48 hours. I mean, you get certain species that prefer it a bit older, that sort of specialist species that have a preference for dung decomposition stage. But I would imagine that probably some allotment holders do see dung beetles that break it down. I don't necessarily know if you'd need it. I mean, you're sort of doing dung beetle, you're putting that manure within your soil to support sort of nitrate improvements or add quality to the soil, and that's essentially what dung beetles are doing in our pasture land and places.
So we've got 3 questions asking the same thing. It's basically, how do dung beetles navigate? How do they find the poo?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways that they actually navigate. So their antennae on top of their head, as I mentioned, they can sort of almost smell or taste or sense where the poo is. Again, this is under researched, I believe. So I think this is from sort of slim pickings of research. And yeah, so their antennae are really important in that, but they're also celestial navigators. So by that, so especially in sort of other countries where, in like the southern hemisphere, where there will be rollers and they'll roll the dung. And when they're rolling the dung, the main aim is to get it as far away as possible from the main dung pat, because dung is actually quite a precious reserve for dung beetles. There's not actually as much of it as they would probably like. So they try to get it as far away as possible from the dung pat. So those rollers use things like the sun or the moon to navigate in a straight line to get as far away from either sort of other things that are going to try and take their dung from them. So when they roll into balls, it's actually quite easy to steal other dung beetles' sort of poo. So they will use the moon and the sunlight to sort of navigate. I think it might be to do with magnesium in there. I don't know if I'm just making that up, but that's ringing a bell, that the magnesium in their heads will allow them to use the light to sort of be directional about getting as far away from that pat as possible. And also their antennae are really, really important for finding the poo and smelling out the poo. As I mentioned, if you're ever wanting to experiment, I would recommend sitting next to a fresh dung pat and seeing how long it takes for dung beetles to start colonising that specific pat, because it's quite fun.
Good way to while away time. So I think we've got time for one more question, and it says, what options are there for farmers who need to take in their cattle in the depths of winter? So again, it's another sort of best practice question, I think.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. I suppose if you fancy it, you could translocate some dung. You could actually move some of the dung that's within the barn outside onto the pasture. It's probably adding more work to a farmer's day. But I've never really thought about that, but that's a really interesting point. I suppose if there's a potential, you could let them out for for some of the day rather than the whole of the winter. So maybe a couple times a week or just for the day, and then bring them back in over winter at night time into the barn. Or translocate the dung, put some dung outside. It's almost like you're feeding the dung beetles, but maybe like once a week would even help, or anything would help if they're overwintering for the whole of the winter months. Sort of picking up the dung and taking it outside. It's the only thing I can really think of off the top of my head.
Brilliant. Thank you, Harriet. We've had lots of comments coming into the Q&A just saying thank you very much, and it was really interesting. It's not a topic I knew much about, so I found the whole thing fascinating. So thank you very much.